One, Santa is making his list and checking it twice. Once he checks it twice, he gives it to his elves to prepare his sleigh with all the toys. Santa then checks to make sure all the toys are there. Santa is using what type of measurement? Okay, so Santa has made his list, he's checked it twice, and now he's passed his list off to the elves. And we're trying to figure out what type of measurement Santa used to do what? Well, to make sure all the toys are there. Half the battle with some of these questions is making sure you're identifying what behavior we're looking at, whose behavior we're looking at. If you can identify those first, you're going to have a much better chance of getting the question correctly. So we're looking at Santa's behavior of measuring if all the toys are there. So what is your prediction here? If he's made a list, he then gives the list to the elves who prepare the sleigh. Santa then comes behind them just to make sure all the toys are there. Was Santa sitting there observing all the elves and everything they were doing, putting the toys in the sleigh? No, he had a list. He gave it to them. He let them do their job. And then he came behind them and he can easily see, is it done? Is it not? So what type of measurement is that? A, play check. A planned activity check, remember, is a type of momentary time sampling, but just in a group format. Santa is not using momentary time sampling here, right? He's not using interval recording. He's not using time sampling. He's using a different sort of measurement. So it's not play check. B, permanent product. What is Santa measuring? Well, Santa is measuring the product or what the elves have produced. And he's done that by coming behind them and just checking on their behavior. The elves' behavior produced a full sleigh, hopefully. That is the idea with permanent product. You don't actually have to watch every instance of behavior occurring to measure it. And that's what Santa's doing. He's doing a permanent product check. Frequency, did Santa count the toys? It doesn't say that, right? It doesn't say Santa was counting the toys. He's just checking to make sure they're all there. And then whole interval. Remember, it's not a discontinuous measurement, not momentary time sampling, it's not interval recording. Santa is using a permanent product check based on his list to make sure they've completed everything he asked them to prepare. Question 2. A skill acquisition plan is created to teach a client to use an ATM. The client is taught using a chaining procedure and is able to use their card at a fake ATM machine at their house. What should the next step be in the plan? Think about this one a little bit. Okay, it's a little harder, but you can do it. So think about our skill acquisition plan. When we create them, we pick goals and we pick skills we want to create and teach, and then we're going to try to come up with an idea of what that skill is going to look like after it's all said and done. And a crucial part of that plan is always, always, always generalization. Generalization occurs when a skill happens outside of the teaching environment. If we're not generalizing, we're not truly doing our job. So in this case, we have our plan. Our goal is to get our client to use an ATM. We have our procedure, which is chaining, and we get them to the point where they can do the behavior in their house. But is using their card at a fake ATM machine gonna be socially valid and gonna be useful if they can't do it elsewhere? No. So after we've gotten to the point where they can actually do the skill in a controlled environment, in a learning environment, what's next? A, teach the client to budget their earnings. Well, we still need to make sure what? Still need to make sure they can use an ATM outside of the house, right? We're not quite to budgeting earnings yet if they still can't get money out of an ATM. B, teach the client how to apply for jobs. Jobs really has nothing to do with the ATM machine. Again, that's kind of jumping ahead. That's a different skill. We're focused on this plan, right? What's the next step in this plan? C, have the client use the ATM at a bank. Here we go. Now we are looking at what? Now we're looking at generalization. We've taught you the skill. Can you go ahead and generalize it outside of the house. And then D, have the client write out a reminder checklist for using the ATM. Is that really going to show us he can generalize? No, he's just creating a prompt, right? We need him to be able to just on his own go to an ATM outside of the house and use it. So the next step after we've mastered this part is generalize. How are we going to generalize? We're going to have the client use an ATM at, let's say, a bank. If a functional behavior assessment indicates that the learner's behavior is occurring to access a tangible, how would you likely put the behavior on extinction? Slow down and read this one and make sure. He's just creating a prompt, right? Occurring to. We're going to have the client use functional behavior at, let's say, a bank. All right, to what else? All the plan, right? It's not play check. By user king the house. It's when we teach and then generalization. Generalization occurs when we're not the end card at they can act now, right? Here we go. Can you go ahead and client say slow down and read the rule? How would you likely put the behavior on extinction? Slow down and read this one and make sure we understand it. If a functional behavior assessment indicates the learner's behavior is occurring to access a tangible. So our function is what? Accessing a tangible. The question is asking us, how are we going to put that behavior on extinction? So you have to think about extinction. With extinction, we're withholding reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior. So what does the function tell us about extinction? Well, it identifies where we need to withhold reinforcement. If our function is accessing a tangible, we're going to need to do what? We're going to need to prevent access to that tangible, right? So that's how we're going to try to put the behavior on extinction. So A, anytime the learner asks for an item, ignore the request. Now, careful here. Yes, ignoring the request might be denying access to tangibles in that moment, but by ignoring the request, we're really just denying attention. We can still acknowledge the request, we just have to withhold tangible. So A is okay, it's just not fully complete. If we ignore the request and they still get access, we haven't really done extinction. B, whenever the learner attempts to obtain the item, withhold access. This is much more clear, much more complete. Anytime the learner attempts to obtain the item through maybe poor behavior, by asking for it, by taking it without permission, we have to withhold access. B is just much more complete than A. A gives us one scenario, which could be also withholding attention, they could still get access. B is saying no matter what, we're withholding access and in turn, withholding reinforcement. Always read all of your answer choices. C, prevent the sensory sensation of the behavior from occurring. When we prevent the sensory sensation, we're putting automatic behavior on extinction. And then D, follow through when a task demand is placed on the learner. When we follow through with a task demand, we are putting escape avoidance on extinction. So, how are we going to put this behavior on extinction for accessing a tangible? Well, B, whenever the learner attempts to obtain the item, withhold access. full stop.
How can a Capital One 360 performance savings account with one of the best savings rates in America help you grow your money? Set automatic savings rules to easily save for that next big adventure. The Caribbean. Nice. There are no monthly fees, as in zilch, zero, nada, nil. And there's no minimum deposit required to open, keep, or use your account. You can get started with just a penny. And that's just the start. Help.
Blaine is sitting across from Tony. Blaine looks at Tony, says, "What is 2 plus 4?" Tony says, 7. If Blaine is using discrete trial teaching and wants to use a visual prompt, how should he respond? All right, whose behavior are we looking at? We're looking at Blaine. And what is Blaine doing? Blaine is using discrete trial teaching. He wants to use a visual prompt, and now he needs to respond to Tony. So, what is the setup? Well, he looks at Tony and says, "What is 2 plus 4?" Tony says 7. So, Tony's given the response. Blaine now has to follow the response. How does he respond? Remember, he wants to use the visual prompt. A, give corrective feedback and reintroduce the SD. Okay, but what are we missing with A? Well, he didn't use his prompt, and we have to use our visual prompt because that's what the question is indicating. B, give corrective feedback, give the visual prompt, and reintroduce the SD. At one point in DTT does the prompt occur? Does it occur as a consequence, or does it occur before the response? What occurs before the response, right? The typical order is going to be SD, prompt, response, consequence. In this case, we have consequence, prompt, SD. It's not the right order. The prompt follows the SD. C, give the visual prompt and reintroduce the SD. Again, visual prompts or any prompts follow the SD. SD and then prompt. D, give corrective feedback, good, consequence. Reintroduce the SD, good, and then give the prompt. D is the right order. We have our response, 7. We give corrective feedback, the consequence. We reintroduce the SD, and then we prompt. It's very important you know the order of when the prompt occurs. The prompt follows the SD, but comes before the response. How would you explain shaping to a parent who does not know anything about applied behavior analysis? And this is meeting our guideline for not using jargon and not using technical language. You need to get good at explaining ABA terms in very common, understandable language where anybody listening can understand what you're talking about. In this case, we want to explain shaping. So you have to explain it to someone who knows nothing about applied behavior analysis, meaning we're going to avoid technical terms and jargon that only we understand. So, what is shaping? Well, shaping, we are picking a behavior, right? Reinforcing approximations of that behavior until we reach a terminal behavior. Now, that's a very complex technical answer, right? Because we're going to positively reinforce or negatively reinforce. We're going to reinforce approximations for the terminal behavior. But that's not how we want to explain it, right? We need to explain it much more simply. So A, each time your child gets closer to the final behavior, we will reward them. That sounds exactly like what we're talking about. Each time your child gets closer, approximations, to the final behavior or terminal behavior, we will reward them, reinforce. Anybody can understand that. This is a really good, simple explanation of shaping. B, for each successive approximation, stop right there. Do they know what a successive approximation is? Probably not. Right? That is jargon, that's technical. Avoid that. See, positive reinforcement will be used every time your child gets closer to the terminal behavior. Still, we have positive reinforcement and terminal behavior. You're now just introducing more things you need to explain. The question is, what is shaping? You need to be able to explain shaping without following up with 20 more explanations, right? If you just say each time your child gets closer to the final behavior, we're going to reward them, everybody knows what you're talking about. D, we picked a terminal behavior problem and we'll be reinforcing successful approximations towards that behavior. This is a great definition of shaping, but it's technical, it's jargon filled. We might understand it. People who know nothing about ABA do not. If we're going to explain it to someone who knows nothing about ABA, we need to keep it simple. Each time your child gets closer, approximations to the final behavior, terminal behavior, we will reward them. Reinforcement. Whenever a supervisor or another RBT refers to anecdotal data, what do they mean? What is anecdotal data? We hear that term a lot, right? Anecdotal data is not all that useful because it's what? It's really personal opinion, right? It's just what you kind of observed and thought. So whenever your supervisor or another RBT refers to anecdotal data, what are they talking about? A, data that was taken the previous year. Well, maybe, but anecdotal data isn't really taken, right? It's more of an observation and an opinion. B, data that was taken prior to treatment. Again, anecdotal data is not really necessarily tracked and taken, right? Unless you're writing it down. And even then, it's not very scientific. Anecdotal data is really based on personal observation. So no matter if you write it down, if you don't write it down, however you remember it, however you don't remember it, it's really just based on personal observation. It's not all that useful. And then D, data taken after an intervention is over. That would be maintenance data. So anecdotal data is really personal observation based. What do you think? What did you feel? What did you see? Not that scientific, not super useful. We should not be making our decisions on anecdotal data. Who is primarily responsible for ensuring RBTs receive enough supervision and renew their competency assessments on time? This one is very obvious. Do not overthink it. Who's responsible for you, the RBT, receiving enough supervision? Is it responsible? They have to competency assessment. We can't go out your way. Who's prior that you renew your which of the following statements is true about an extinction procedure? So let's think about extinction. We talked about it a little earlier. Extinction is just withholding reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior. When we think about extinction, we think about extinction bursts and spontaneous recovery and that kind of thing. This question is asking about true statements. So one of these is true, three is false. A, response blocking is an effective method of extinction. Is response blocking considered extinction? It is not. In order to be extinction, The learner has to have the opportunity to engage in the response. Excuse me. If you block the response, it is not extinction. B, extinction is a type of punishment procedure. No, extinction is its own type of procedure. We have reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. That's our three major types, right? Extinction and punishment are two different things. C, behavior can occur even after extinction was successful. Absolutely. And what do we call that? Well, we call that spontaneous recovery, right? Spontaneous recovery, the sudden reemergence of a behavior that was previously extinguished or put in extinction. And then D, extinction must be done for several months in order to be effective. Not true. Extinction is dependent on a lot of factors, how well it's implemented, how often it's implemented, how consistently it's implemented, previous reinforcement schedules, reinforcement history. Many, many factors go into it. Sometimes extinction works immediately. Sometimes it does take a very long time. But this is a very definitive statement that just isn't always true. What is true, though, is that behavior can always occur even after extinction was successful. Spontaneous recovery is something that can occur whenever, right? The behavior's been gone for a long time, and all of a sudden, it comes back. Billy needs to save some money. He thinks he's going out with his friends too often during the week. In order to change his going out habits, what does he need to reduce? What does Billy need to worry about as far as going out every week? He's going out too much, right? So his frequency is too high. If he's going out 5 nights a week, he needs to reduce that. Well, we don't have frequency as an answer choice, but what do we have as an answer choice, which is like kind of a proxy of frequency? We have rate, and rate is what? Rate is just frequency with a time component added, right? So even though we don't have frequency, if we reduce the rate, he's now reducing what? Well, he's reducing how many times a week he goes out, which is accomplishing the same goal. Latency doesn't get him there because that's just a single response. Into response time, he probably needs to increase into response time. In duration, we're not looking at the total time of anything. Billy needs to reduce how many times per week he goes out. And that's perfect for rate, right? We have our frequency, how many, and then our time, week, how many times per week. Great. Glad you watched. Please like and subscribe. Check out btexamreview.com. As always, work hard, study hard. We'll see you soon.
What is that?
It's called light.
All right, welcome back to ABA Exam Review. Today we're continuing our RBT practice exam series. Shout out. Other than that, let's work hard in place. The client can imitate. What type of prompt would be best to use? There are a couple key. Make sure you let us know so we can include you in our Sunday shout out. Other than that, let's work hard, study hard, get to our questions. Question 1. A client's parents don't want to use physical prompting, but a most to least prompting strategy is in place. The client can imitate. What type of prompt would be best to use? There are a couple key things in this question that we need to consider. First, what is the question asking? Well, it's asking about what type of prompt we're planning on using. And we're going to determine that with the given information in the question. So first, we know they don't want to use physical prompting. So we have to just get rid of physical prompting, right? In this case, our information says they don't want to use it. We're not going to use it. But we are using a most to least strategy, meaning we can't use physical prompting, but we still need to use a prompt that is pretty intrusive. So if we can't use physical prompting, what is the next in our hierarchy prompt that is intrusive compared to physical prompting? Well, next up is going to be modeling. And if we're going to use a modeling prompt, we need to make sure that the client can imitate. Well, in the question, it tells us the client can imitate. So based on this information, We can assume what? We can assume we're going to use a modeling prompt from use my best stimuli, gesture or cookie. What? Reach into the cookie jar and find a cookie to eat. The cookie jar functions as a what? So we just put out our reinforcement video. Make sure you go check that out. We are talking about here the chocolate chip cookies in relation to the cookie jar. You are craving the chocolate chip cookies, so you're looking to find cookies, right? The motivation for chocolate chip cookies is high. But until you find chocolate chip cookies or something that tells you chocolate chip cookies are available, we haven't found an SD yet. When you see the cookie jar, and you reach inside, you find a cookie to eat. So now, when you see the cookie jar, what is that cookie jar signaling to you? A, it's an SD for positive reinforcement. Is the cookie jar now signaling positive reinforcement is available? Well, absolutely. You had motivation, the value of the cookies were high. You saw the cookie jar, you reached into the cookie jar, and you found what? Cookies. You found your positive reinforcement. So now, when you see the cookie jar, it is signaling to you that positive reinforcement in the form of these cookies is available. SD for negative reinforcement. Well, negative reinforcement wasn't delivered, right? You gained the cookie from the response of reaching into the cookie jar. And it wasn't a punishment procedure because in the future, we can assume that if you're looking for cookies, you're going to go back to the cookie jar. And why? Because it is now an SD for positive reinforcement. And every time you see that cookie jar, it's signaling to you, hey, there are cookies in here. Positive reinforcement is available once you reach inside and grab a cookie. And you have to remember that, right? The motivations can be high, the MOs can be high, but until we get a stimulus that signals to us reinforcement is available, there is no SD. In the case of the cookie jar, once we get positive reinforcement from reaching inside the cookie jar now becomes an SD for positive reinforcement. Simply put, though, in a much more simpler way, the cookie jar is simply signaling to you that reinforcement is available in the form of these cookies. What is an appropriate way to describe a primary reinforcer? Now, remember, we have two main types of reinforcers, right? We have conditioned and we have unconditioned. Our unconditioned reinforcers are also known as primary reinforcers. Our conditioned reinforcers are known as secondary reinforcers. So in this case, we want to describe a primary reinforcer, also known as an unconditioned reinforcer. And what do we mean by unconditioned? Well, we mean that the reinforcer has no learning history, right? It's not paired with anything. We didn't have to create it. It is just innately a reinforcer. Most commonly, we think about food, water, things like warmth. Given a long enough time, they'd be reinforcing for anybody. Okay. We don't have to pair food and water and breathing, right? And oxygen with anything for them to serve as reinforcement. Okay. They're primary unconditioned reinforcement. So if we're going to describe our primary unconditioned reinforcers, how are we going to go about doing that? A, it is a stimulus that the learner wants the most. Well, not necessarily. Just because it's unconditioned, just because it's primary, doesn't mean that the learner wants it the most. All right. A lot of people don't necessarily enjoy drinking water, right? They need it. It is a primary reinforcer. If they go long enough without it, they're going to want it, but it's not necessarily what they want the most all the time. B, it is a stimulus that is reinforcing without any learning history. Good. And that is really what it comes down to. Primary reinforcers do not require any learning history, they don't require any pairing to function as reinforcement. Read all of your answer choices. That's our golden rule. C, it is a stimulus that is reinforcing through pairing. This one is for secondary and conditioned reinforcement. When we pair neutral stimuli with primary or unconditioned stimuli, we get secondary and conditioned stimuli. That's a little higher level, but pairing is what creates new conditioned reinforcement. Primary reinforcers are not conditioned. And then D, it is a stimulus that functions like money. Money is not primary, money is secondary, money is conditioned. Until money is paired with something valuable, money has no value, right? That's why little kids don't understand the value of money. It hasn't been conditioned yet. If we're talking primary, we're talking unconditioned and we're talking stimulus that is reinforcing without any learning history. No pairing required. After several months of teaching a client to use their microwave in his apartment, what will be next if checking for maintenance was the goal? Now be careful here. This one is a little bit tricky. What is our goal here? Our goal is checking for maintenance. Start there. This is why we are very careful. We systematically read the question and understand the question before going into the answer choices. We're not in a rush. Our goal is checking for maintenance. So, what is maintenance? Maintenance is one of our vocabulary words. So, let's define it. Maintenance is simply saying the learner can still do the skill after learning stops, after teaching stops. Meaning, you teach a skill, teaching stops, the learner can still do the skill. So, if we want to check for maintenance, how are we going to go about doing that if our skill is using the microwave? A, continue teaching the microwave skill, but fade some of the reinforcement. With true maintenance, are we still teaching that skill? We are not. The only way to verify that a skill is actually maintaining is to remove all teaching. That's what maintenance is. You're no longer being taught it, but you still can do it. B, start teaching the microwave skill in a different setting. If we start teaching in a different setting, what are we starting to program for? We're really starting to program for generalization, right? Because we taught it in the apartment. So we want to look for maintenance in the apartment. Maintenance can only occur if we already know they can do the skill in the environment. If we're teaching in a different setting, then we're just programming for generalization. C, stop teaching the skill and ask the client to use a microwave a week later. Good. This is about as close as we'll get, right? We're no longer teaching the skill, but we're still going to check to see can they still break down or can they still use their microwave. C, as close to maintenance as we might get. D, ask the client to use the microwave in a new setting. Again, this is similar to B. This is just generalization. We're not worried about the new settings right now. We want to know maintenance. If we stop teaching them the skill, will they still be able to use their microwave? That's what we're looking for. And in order to check for that, we need to stop teaching the skill and then ask the client to use the microwave a week later. C is our answer. A home for juvenile delinquents is convinced that withholding television is a good punishment for using bad language. How would we know this intervention functioned as punishment? When we are describing something as a punisher or when we're describing something as punishment, what are we really saying? We're really saying that it's a consequence that is decreasing behavior. Okay. We're not defining it by the topography. We're not defining it by traditional terminology or traditional thinking. All we're concerned with is it decreasing the behavior? Same thing with reinforcement. The only way something is reinforcing or considered reinforcement is if it increases behavior. Something is only punishing if it decreases behavior. Full stop. So if we have this home for delinquents who is withholding television and they're saying it's a good punishment for using bad language, how are we going to know for sure that it functioned as a punishment? Well, we need to see how is it changing behavior. A, we can be sure it is punishing because something preferred is being withheld. Absolutely not. This should never be your thinking with either reinforcement or punishment. We're not defining it by how it looks. It needs to be defined by how it affects future behavior. B, we would want to look at how the usage of bad language changed in the future. Perfect. They say it's punishment. We say, okay, has the bad language decreased? If it has, then we can say, all right, well, it is functioning as punishment. If bad language has not changed, it is not functioning at all as punishment. So we have to look at the future behavior of bad language. C, we would want to look at how the current usage of bad language changed. We're not concerned with current usage. You can't change a behavior that already occurred. We're changing future behavior with consequences. And then D, we would want to figure out if the television was reinforcing. That has nothing to do with it being a punisher. Okay. We're worried about how is this withholding television going to change bad language in the future? If it's not changing anything, it's not punishing. If it's decreasing it, it is punishing. So, how would we know this intervention functioned as punishment? Well, we would want to look at how the usage of bad language changed in the future. A behavior assessment indicates that the target behavior is using a spoon incorrectly and the replacement behavior is using the spoon the right way. If you were told to use differential reinforcement, what behavior would you put on extinction? Think about this question. It isn't tricky, but the wording is different than typical DR questions. So we're talking about differential reinforcement and extinction. Okay, and extinction is part of differential reinforcement. So what is extinction? Extinction, we're withholding reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior in order to decrease that behavior. Okay, so if we're using differential reinforcement, what are we doing? Well, we're putting on extinction the behavior we want to decrease or stop, and we're increasing other behaviors, right? We're reinforcing other behaviors. So we're looking for the behavior we're putting on extinction. And the behavior assessment indicates the target behavior is using a spoon incorrectly, and the replacement behavior is using the spoon the right way. So what makes this a little tricky is we don't ever use the word decrease, right? But you have to kind of use your context clues and figure out, well, if our target behavior is using the spoon incorrectly and we have a replacement behavior, then we're going to want to reduce what behavior? Well, of course, the target, because we're replacing the target behavior with the other behavior, which is using the spoon the right way. So, what behavior are you going to put on extinction? A, using the spoon incorrectly. Right. We want to reduce using the spoon incorrectly. So, we're going to withhold reinforcement from using the spoon incorrectly. And we're going to reinforce what? Well, of course, using the spoon the right way. C, using a fork. Using a fork is not part of the plan. Okay. So we're not really sure what we're doing with the fork. All right. All we know is our target behavior is using the spoon incorrectly. Nothing is being said about the fork. So don't just start assuming and adding information that really isn't there. And then D cannot be determined. Well, of course it can be determined. Okay. We're going to use extinction on our target behavior because we're teaching the replacement behavior of using the spoon the right way. So, what behavior are we going to put on extinction? A, using the spoon incorrectly. Team USA was eliminated from the World Cup after a 3-1 loss. Team USA scored around at the 76th minute, but the Netherlands scored at the 81st minute. 5 minutes would likely represent what measurement in the scenario as it relates to scoring? All right, let's think about this one. Okay. Team USA was eliminated from the World Cup after a 3-1 loss. Not really what we're worried about, right? What are we worried about here? We're worried about scoring. Okay. So Team USA scored around the 76th minute. The Netherlands scored at the 81st minute. 5 minutes is going to represent what as it relates to scoring. So, how does 5 minutes relate to these two goals? Well, we know what? We know 5 minute passes in between scoring. So if we're looking at the time in between two responses, what do we call that? A, frequency. We're not counting anything. It's not a how many or not a count. B, duration. Now be very careful here. Duration is what? Duration is the length of time of one behavior. Are we measuring the length of time for a behavior? We're not. We're measuring the time in between the behaviors. So just picture this right here, the time in between the 76th and the 81st minute. That's what we're measuring here. Are we measuring latency? Are we measuring the time from an SD to a goal? Again, we're not. We're measuring the time in between goal scoring, in between responses. So the time in between responses is what? What's enter response time? Got to be very careful when dealing with timing questions. Duration, latency, IRT all deal with time, but in different ways. Duration looks at the total length of a response. Latency is the SD to the response. Inter response time is time in between two responses. Here we have a score at 76 and a score at 81. Our time in between is our inter response time. A task analysis should be concerned with which of the following items when creating the behavior chain. All right, kind of a fluency question on behavior chains and task analysis. What is a task analysis? Task analysis is breaking down a complex skill into steps to create a behavior chain. A behavior chain is what we teach. It's the steps we teach to teach a larger behavior, right? Pretty simple. Task analysis comes first, break down the behavior, create the behavior chain. Easy enough. Now, the question is asking about when using a task analysis, what should we be concerned with? What should we be concerned with when creating a behavior chain? Should we be concerned with A, the length of the behavior chain? Well, sure. We don't want it too short where there's not enough steps, but we don't want it 50 steps, right? We don't want it extremely long. So we need to determine what is the proper length of that chain. B, the difficulty of the behavior chain. Well, absolutely. Too easy, and we might not actually teach the skill. Too hard, and we'll never teach the skill. Length and difficulty really do matter. C, the skill level of the learner engaging with the behavior chain. That is absolutely a priority, right? We need to personalize these things, and the skill level is going to directly impact the length and the difficulty. If we have a learner with a really high skill level, then our length and difficulty are going to be drastically different than a learner with no skill, right? So we have to be concerned with all of these things when making the behavior chain because how we create the behavior chain is going to really impact our success when teaching the chain. So, what of the following items should we be concerned with? Well, the length, difficulty, and skill level. So, really, D, all the above. Fantastic. Thank you for watching. Make sure you check out btexamreview.com for all of our practice exams, study guides, and combo packs. Like, subscribe, practice. Fantastic. We see the following items when creating the behavior chain. Behavior, create the behavior chain. Easy enough. Now, the question is asking about when using a task analysis, what should we be concerned with? What should we be concerned with when creating a behavior chain? Should we be concerned with A, the length of the behavior chain? Well, sure. We don't want it too short where there's not enough steps, but we don't want it 50 steps, right? We don't want it extremely long. So we need to determine what is the proper length of that chain. B, the difficulty of the behavior chain. Well, absolutely. Too easy, and we might not actually teach the skill. Too hard, and we'll never teach the skill. Length and difficulty really do matter. C, the skill level of the learner engaging with the behavior chain. That is absolutely a priority, right? We need to personalize these things, and the skill level is going to directly impact the length and the difficulty. If we have a learner with a really high skill level, then our length and difficulty are going to be drastically different than a learner with no skill, right? So we have to be concerned with all of these things when making the behavior chain because how we create the skill study hard. All right, welcome back to ABA Exam Review, where today we're going through our RBT exam practice session, where we're going through the next set of questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. If you're looking for RBT study materials, please check out btexamreview.com. We offer 3 practice exams, a task list study guide, and of course, our famous combo pack. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in our Sunday shout out. Other than that, let's work hard, study hard, get to our questions. Question 1. What is a primary disadvantage of using continuous measurement for tracking behavior? Think about the 3 main types of measurement you need to know as an RBT. We have to know continuous, discontinuous, and permanent product. What separates continuous measurement from the other 2 is that with continuous measurement, you are continually observing the behavior for as long as you're with the learner. So if you're with the learner for 3 hours, continuous measurement takes place over the course of 3 hours. Now, what would be a disadvantage of using this type of measurement? A, it is the least accurate type of measurement. That is incorrect, right? Continuous measurement tends to be more accurate than discontinuous or permanent product because you're constantly observing the behavior occur. B, it can only be done during a specific time of the day. Again, not true, right? You can use continuous measurement whenever, but you need to use it throughout. Whenever you're with the learner, you have to continuously measure whatever you're looking for. C, it takes considerable time and resources. Yes, it takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment to continuously measure the same behavior for long periods of time. It's why in group settings, continuous measurement can be quite difficult. So, a disadvantage is definitely the amount of time and resources it takes. And then D, it is not good for individual learners. No, continuous measurement is actually great for individual learners. When you're working one on one, continuous measurement is actually typically a pretty good choice. So, a disadvantage of using continuous measurement is that it takes a considerable amount of time and resources. Two, although a learner's motivation can be high, this does not necessarily mean a reinforcer is available. What needs to be present to tell the learner that a reinforcer is available? Okay, kind of a tricky question. Let's break it down. We're looking at what needs to be present to tell the learner that a reinforcer is available. In other words, what signals that the reinforcer is available? Because the learner's motivation can be high, it doesn't mean the reinforcer is available. My motivation for margaritas can be very high, but unless there's a signal that margarita is available, I can't get one. So, what signals that the reinforcer is actually available? A, the MO. The motivating operation doesn't signal, right? The motivating operation alters the value and increases or decreases motivation. The SD is what signals that reinforcement is available. There has to be an SD present to tell the learner that a reinforcer is available. Although a prompt is an antecedent, it is not the actual signal for that reinforcement is available. Okay. Prompts can temporarily act as SDs depending on when you use the prompt, but what needs to be present is an actual SD. A student author the actual signal for that reinforcement is available. Okay. Prompts can tip. In order to answer that question, we have to identify the type of measurement we're using. In this case, the student is tapping his pencil and you're using event recording. Now, what is event recording? Event recording is essentially frequency data. Essentially, all you're doing is counting how many times something happens. So, if you're going to use event recording to record tapping pencil on desk, what are you going to record? A, the length of time in between taps. What type of measurement would that be? If we're going length of time in between responses? Well, that's going to be into response time. B, each time the step of the then do it on the rope. Notice we do at the end there. The mom always moves the spoon away and pushes the baby's hands down. What does this most resemble? All right, kind of a vague question. It's a behavior question first and foremost. And whose behavior are we looking at? You always have to answer that question. Whose behavior am I looking at? Well, we're really looking at the mom's behavior, right? Because we're talking all about the mom. The mom is spoon feeding carrots. Each time she puts the spoon in the baby's mouth, the baby tries to grab the spoon. So the mom moves the spoon away and pushes the baby hands down. So what does this most resemble? What is the mom doing? A, response blocking. Response blocking is preventing a response from being able to occur. Can the baby grab the spoon if the mom is constantly pushing the baby's hands down? No, the mom is blocking the response from occurring. Extinction and response blocking are different things. And this is an important thing to note. Extinction, you have to give the learner an opportunity to engage in the response for it to truly be extinction. This is simply preventing the response from ever occurring. So response blocking and extinction are not the same. It is not an antecedent intervention because it is a consequence of what? Well, uh, blocking. What do you need to consider when fading out reinforcement? That is what the question is asking. So think about weekend. What strategy would not be effective at destructive punishment? Positive increase. Five, check out BT study. All right, welcome back to ABA exam review. Today we're continuing our RBT practice exam series where we're going through the